I'm here with Robert Rapier. We're at the ASPO-USA conference in Austin, Texas. Robert, how are you doing today?
I'm good. It's been a long day, long couple of days actually.
Now, you had a really great talk this morning, but a little bit different from talks you've done in past years. You've added a few things in there. What did you add and change over the last year?
Yeah, a lot of these times I talk about biofuels and renewable energy and due diligence. And this time I talked about really more framing the whole problem that we're facing of our oil dependence. And for a more general audience, I will name 5 problems that we're facing. And here I focused on just 3. Our dependence on oil, first of all, I go through and I show what our global oil production looks like, how much our imports are costing us, and try to establish that this is a real serious cost to our economy. And then I try to show that there are threats that could make this much worse. For example, our dependence on OPEC. We get 40% of our imports from OPEC. They could bring us to our knees overnight if they decided, if there was regime change in Saudi Arabia that was hostile to the U.S., they could just wreck our economies. It would be 1973 all over again. Most of the remaining oil reserves are in Saudi Arabia, in OPEC countries, and in Russia, 83%. So, looking forward, we don't have the oil. They've got the oil. They're going to get rich at our expense if we don't do something to get off of oil.
What was the most interesting thing, maybe one fact, that you're taking away from the conference this year?
That's a good question. I'm surprised, like the last presentation where he talked about I don't remember his name, where he talked about a price limit that at $120 or something like that he didn't think that oil could sustain above that price. And I'm very surprised at that, given that Europe routinely pays $300 to $400 a barrel and still consumes double the consumption of. If everybody in the world was allotted equal amount of oil, it'd be 4.7 barrels of oil. Europe still consumes 10 barrels of oil per person per year, and they're paying $300 to $400 a barrel. So,
and for people in the U.S., on average, we're consuming about 22 barrels.
22, but it's going down. In Europe, it's going down. In all the developing countries, it's going up. And so, developing countries who use just a little, imagine what they're using it for. They're using it for absolute necessities, things we take for granted. So $120 is very painful for us in the U.S., but if you look, when oil prices went past $100, demand did not decline there. Demand continued to grow in all those developing regions. So for him to say that, that's not a fact. That's kind of an anti-fact as far as I'm concerned, but that's something that kind of stuck with me.
Now, one of the things you mentioned is that you had kind of a visual of what would happen in the future if oil prices went very high, that there would be certain countries that would be priced out of the market. They'd no longer be able to afford the oil.
Right.
And so that would, the oil would still be available in the same amounts to the Europe and to the U.S. and the other developed countries.
Right.
But you seem to have kind of turned your opinion on that.
The data proved me wrong. I had a narrative in my head that this is what would happen. It made sense to me. Poor countries, they can't afford $100 oil. But data came in and I saw that it was wrong. I saw that the developed countries decreased their oil consumption at $100 oil, and the developing countries continued to grow by double digits. And I finally realized why that is. And the reason it is we consume 22 barrels, but we consume a lot of oil we don't have to consume. So it's very easy for us to cut back just a little bit of oil. But when you're consuming oil just to ride a moped, 10 miles to work or something like that, a very, very small amount of oil, but a lot of people, $100 oil really doesn't affect you that much. You are, that is so valuable versus the alternative for you. The alternative, and I've said this before, people say, how much do you think we'd pay for gasoline? See, it depends on what the alternative is. If I can put a gallon of gasoline in a car and drive 40 miles, versus walking 40 miles or biking 40 miles, that gallon is worth a lot. And so that's sort of the way these developing countries are. They're using that as an alternative and to kind of make their quality of life a little bit better, and so it's worth a lot more to them. And that's what's happened. And I mean, we've cut back a little bit of fat. We have a lot of fat in our system. Europe has some fat in their system, a lot of discretionary oil consumption, and they don't have so much discretionary oil consumption.
So what I'm hearing is that even if oil was $300 per barrel, which is twice the price it's ever been, that the developing countries would probably still continue to buy and burn and consume the same amount, whereas the developed nations, they would be the ones that would be cutting back.
Correct. That is correct. There is a price where demand will slow down in the developing countries. I don't know what that price is, but again, I look at Europe and I say at $350 a barrel equivalent, of course, because of taxes, they still consume 10 barrels of oil per person. China consumes 2. So where's the real pain point for them? I don't know. But, even Africa, South America, all those regions had double-digit demand growth. China and India get a lot of attention. Middle East added a lot of oil consumption over the last 10 years. So everywhere outside of the developed regions had double-digit demand growth.
And what did we learn at this conference about this U.S. going to be independent, energy independent? There's been this recent report out. Is that accurate, or what do you think on that?
Well, there's a lot of skepticism, especially here at this conference. I just came from the Total Energy USA conference in Houston. Very different mindset there. A lot more belief that can actually happen. As I said today, we don't know for sure. I mean, we have to look at the data and we have to estimate, what we think is going to happen. We don't know for sure. So I would not say it can't happen. I don't think it can happen. I think it's highly unlikely. I think the U.S. is going to continue. We import so much oil right now. It's very hard to imagine that we could get high enough to actually be energy independent. I mean, sometimes they talk about North American independence, where we get our oil from Canada only, or Canada and Mexico. That's the only places that we get our oil from. So essentially North America is energy independent. But I don't think the United States will be energy independent ever.
And this idea of energy independence for the U.S., that would rely heavily on the fracking technology. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why oil production in the U.S. has gone up. That's why natural gas production has gone up. Without that, production would have continued to decline. So oil production is going up because of increased production in North Dakota. And, people know about North Dakota. They don't know that in Texas, oil production has gone up even more than it has in North Dakota. And it's fracking. In Texas, mostly in the Eagle Ford shale.
And there are many people that are opposed to fracking. And
right.
What is your take on that? Is the opposition justified?
It's I don't take a strong. I would be a lot more concerned about this if I was in your situation and they're doing it or wanting to do it in my neighborhood. Okay. You asked the question, what's the best argument against fracking? And they said, go light a candle and live in a cave. And that's kind of an insulting answer, but there's some data. I showed you a news headline from yesterday that said that cattle are falling sick in fracking regions. Those things need to be investigated very well. They need to be. I think the anti-fracking forces have put out a lot of misinformation. I think Gasland put out misinformation. So I don't agree with putting out misinformation. And the other side has downplayed things. There's no problem. I don't really know. It's something that's expanded very quickly, and it's something I think should be pretty tightly regulated. Whether I would say it should be banned, I wouldn't argue that unless it can be shown that there is in fact some contamination or some link to illness or livestock or something like that.
Could an argument be made to a state or a municipality that this is a resource that may exist on our land here, and it's a resource that is really selling for a really low price right now. Would it be such a bad thing to have a 30-year moratorium on drilling so that resource is there for the next generation?
Yeah, but you know how government officials are, and you know that they want development, and they want growth, and they want revenue. So it's not an argument that's going to resonate very well with politicians. Maybe some that are kind of bent against fracking anyway, but a lot of them are going to say that's foregone revenue, and I'm not going to be in office in 30 years, and what matters to me is today.
Now, your talk was kind of interesting in that it was the first talk of the conference where climate change was explicitly addressed. Now, why did you include that?
It's one of the threats that, and I knew that immediately after my talk I would be accosted by people who said, I do not believe in man-made climate change. And I was. And I said, look, whether you believe in it or not, there is an acceleration in the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere. At some point, even if you don't believe it's a problem, you have to acknowledge it's a risk. And I'm talking about threat mitigation here, risk mitigation. And that is a very serious, to me, risk, something that has to be taken seriously, even by people who don't believe. I mean, the people who don't believe cannot tell you 100% it is not contributing to temperature increases. They cannot tell you that. They can say, I don't believe it is for various reasons. We've had higher temperatures in the past when CO2 was lower, we had a little ice age, blah, 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 blah. Okay. But it's a threat, and those kind of threats have to be taken seriously. I mean, we're experimenting with the climate, and if they're wrong and we continue to increase carbon dioxide concentrations, we don't have another planet. I mean, it's an experiment that, if you're wrong about, really has grave consequences. So the bad part is, I don't know how you fix it, because the U.S., the emissions up there now belong to the U.S. The historical emissions, the historical inventory is mostly ours. It will be a long time before
You're
China...
saying the carbon dioxide that's in the air, the additional carbon dioxide, that belongs to the U.S.
What's there right now is largely the U.S. What's there in the future is going to be largely the developing countries, again, because of their great expansion in demand. Again, you've got a lot of people. The per capita emissions still, U.S. is by far the highest. Well, Canada's up there too, but compared to the developing countries, our per capita emissions are very, very high. But they have a lot more people. And so cumulatively, by the end of the decade, on the track they're on right now, Asia Pacific will have 50% of the global carbon dioxide emissions. U.S. emissions are going down. In fact, the most of any country in the world over the past few years. The EU emissions are going down, and our ability to influence global CO2 inventory is declining, because to do that, we have to have some kind of alternatives in China, India, and the developing regions so that they can have energy without CO2 emissions. We don't know how to do that. So, I've heard a lot of people say we need to set an example. Okay, we use 22 barrels a person, and China uses 2. How do we set an example? We cut our energy usage in half. We still use 10, and they use 2. So we're really not in a position to tell them, and we don't have technology that can show them how to develop at no increasing oil consumption. I mean, if we were using 1 barrel a day, and we had 1 barrel a person per year, and we had a robust economy, and we were using renewable energy, okay, we've set an example. But we're not in any position to set an example right now. We're nowhere close to being able to set an example.
So does this mean that even if the U.S. stopped burning or contributing to the CO2 emissions, that
if the U.S. and the EU both went to a zero carbon economy tomorrow, then emissions would go back to about mid-90s levels of CO2 emissions globally, and they would be on a very rapid track, and it wouldn't be very long before they were right back to current levels of emissions. So that's what I mean by we've lost our ability to affect this problem. We cannot solve this problem unilaterally, and I don't know how you can solve it, period. I mean, it really would require those developing countries to stop developing. That's where the acceleration's coming from. I mean, even if they stopped right now, you've still got a lot every year going into the atmosphere. So it would really require declines across the board for that to ever come back down. I mean, if you look at the Mauna Loa data over the years, the CO2 increase, the atmospheric CO2 has accelerated. And so that's despite Kyoto, that's despite price spikes, despite everything. The data show that the numbers are accelerating, and that's has to be a concern, even for people who do not believe there's a link. You have to say, well, maybe. I mean, can you promise me there's no link? Would you bet your life on it? I think people say, I wouldn't bet my life on it. I don't think there's a link. Well, if the consequences of something are severe, even if the probability is low, you better address that. It's like fire insurance for your home. Probability your home will burn down is low, but you carry fire insurance because the consequences are devastating. So
people should take the idea of climate change seriously, even if they have their doubts.
Absolutely. I mean, it's people have to acknowledge it is a risk. I mean, there are things that you may not believe, but you have to acknowledge the possibility. I mean, you may not believe, people don't believe their house will burn down. I don't believe my house is going to burn down. I won't bet my life on it. I have fire insurance for that reason, and by the same token, no way can somebody say, I can state with absolute assurance humans are not contributing to global warming. They cannot say that.
Now, you have a book out. It's been out for approximately a year now.
Not quite. It came out in April earlier this year.
Can you tell me a little bit about the book?
Yeah, if there's a theme in the book, it is...
what's the title?
Power Plays, Energy Options in the Age of Peak Oil. And if there's a theme for the book, it is that there is no free lunch, that all energy options have a cost, and we have to really understand those costs and the trade-offs we make as we change out energy options and select different energy options. So the book does an overview of fossil fuels, of renewables, energy policy, looked at energy politics. That was the most interesting chapter for me to write, is looking at energy politics over the last 8 presidents. That was quite interesting. Just a chapter there on corn ethanol and how to maybe make that more sustainable, a more sustainable industry, something, because I've got a bad rap for being against corn ethanol, and the fact is I'm against the system that we've set up. But I'm not against corn ethanol. Corn ethanol could be done sustainably, locally, but we've created a system that's perverse, and that we're pulling fossil aquifers down in Nebraska to make corn, to make ethanol, to ship to California. Now that doesn't make sense. Iowa, that gets lots of rainfall, they are the Saudi Arabia of ethanol, and yet they're exporting all that ethanol and they're importing gasoline. They're one of the top 10 consumers of gasoline per capita, which is insane. The difference in Saudi Arabia and Iowa is Saudi Arabia does meet their own needs first, and they export the excess. Iowa exports almost everything and backfills with gasoline, petroleum. That is not a wise energy policy that would encourage that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for talking to me today.
Yep, you bet.
And we're here at the ASPO-USA conference, the national conference in Austin, Texas, and this is Robert Rapier. So thanks for joining us, and see you next time.
Thanks, Aaron.